They said she never spoke again after that night. Not to her children. Not to her servants. Not even to God. In the summer of 1824, in the quiet estate of Ashcroft, Virginia, a widow sealed a single room in her mansion with bricks and mortar. She told the workers never to ask why. She paid them double their wages, gave strict instructions that the door was never to be opened again, and then dismissed them from service. The room became legend, a wound in the house, silent and forbidden. For nearly 2 centuries, no one knew what was inside. But when that door was finally broken open in 1929, the men who entered swore they were not alone in that room. They left pale, trembling, refusing to speak, muttering only one phrase: "It should have stayed buried." Tonight, I'm going to tell you the story of the Ashcroft widow, the quiet room she sealed, and what was found inside. But be warned, once you hear it, you cannot unknow it. And you may begin to see the pattern, that the powerful have always hidden truths in silence, waiting for the day someone careless or brave enough pulls the veil back. Her name was Eleanor Ashcroft, a woman draped in tragedy. Her husband, a wealthy tobacco magnate, died in mysterious circumstances. Some whispered poisoning, others whispered debt, but Eleanor never spoke a word. She simply blackened her windows, wore mourning silk, and kept to herself. The Ashcroft estate became a hushed, spectral presence in rural Virginia, a house of whispers. But then came the night every local remembers in fragments. Screams from the upper floor, furniture crashing, a smell of burning paper that lingered in the dawn air. And after, silence. The next morning, servants were dismissed. A mason was hired to brick up one of the upstairs rooms. When asked, Eleanor only said, "No one must enter. Not now, not ever." She lived 20 more years in that house, drifting through its halls like a ghost. And when she died, she left no explanation. Only her sealed room remained, a tomb within a home. But listen carefully, in every generation the truth leaks through the cracks. Because secrets like this are never truly silent. They fester, they wait, and eventually they demand to be known. The mystery of the quiet room gnawed at Ashcroft's descendants. Servants claimed to hear soft weeping from behind the walls. A gardener swore he saw candlelight flicker through a crack at night, though the house was supposedly empty. One maid refused to step foot upstairs after she saw a shadow under the door when no one was there. The family themselves grew uneasy, but superstition chained them. They kept the room sealed. For decades, it was the forbidden heartbeat of the estate. But by 1929, the world had changed. Rational men, historians, professors, skeptics, scoffed at superstition. The estate had fallen into decline, and the sealed chamber became a curiosity for scholars of folklore. When workmen finally tore down the bricks, they expected dust and cobwebs. But they found something else. Something that made one of the men collapse to his knees, muttering prayers. Something that made another vomit in the corner. What they saw was not just history. It was evidence of a deeper pattern, a secret thread connecting old families, strange rituals, and the way power hides itself. And the Ashcroft widow? She wasn't just a grieving wife. She was part of something far darker. But before we step inside that room, I want you to pause. Ask yourself, why do certain stories survive while others are buried? Why do official histories polish the surface while whispers carry the truth? The Ashcroft tale survived not because it was told, but because it was suppressed. Locals warned their children not to speak of it. A pastor burned his own notes after researching it. And when the door was finally opened, the newspapers reported only a discovery of interest, burying the details in silence. That is your first clue. When the truth threatens the system, it is smothered. But smothered truth grows hotter in the dark. And when it breaks free, it scorches everything around it. This is what we are walking into. Not a ghost story. Not a folk tale. A piece of the forbidden archive of history. A pattern that has repeated across generations, where grief and ritual merge into something too powerful for the world to acknowledge. And when you see what Eleanor Ashcroft left behind, you will understand why silence was her only defense. When the masons tore down the first row of bricks, the air that escaped was heavy, foul, like breath trapped for 100 years. Dust filled the hall, but beneath it was something else, a copper tang, faint but undeniable like old blood. The men laughed nervously, muttering about dead rats, but one of them whispered, "That isn't rot, that's the smell of keeping." They worked quickly, as if afraid the air itself would turn against them. And when the final brick fell, they hesitated. Their lantern light spilled into the chamber, but the darkness seemed to swallow it, as though the room resented illumination. Inside, the walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with torn scraps of parchment. Hundreds of them, pinned, nailed, stitched with black thread into the plaster. Each bore symbols, some resembling letters, others far older, geometric, ritualistic shapes that belonged to no known alphabet. At the center of the room sat a single chair, not facing the door, not facing the window, but facing the wall, as if whoever sat there stared endlessly at those symbols. One man muttered, "She was trying to speak to something." Another answered, "No, she was trying to keep something out." The scholars who inspected the room claimed the symbols were meaningless, a woman's madness etched in grief. But that explanation collapses under scrutiny. Some of the markings matched patterns found in ancient grimoires from Europe, texts whispered to have been carried across the Atlantic by secret societies. Others mirrored designs found in native burial sites, patterns not yet known in Eleanor's time. How could a secluded widow in Virginia reproduce them with such precision? Unless someone taught her. Someone older, hidden, guiding. Imagine it. A woman widowed under mysterious circumstances, sealing herself in ritual, surrounding herself with forbidden symbols, choosing silence over confession. This wasn't madness. It was initiation. The quiet room was not a prison. It was a chamber of binding. She wasn't grieving. She was guarding. And the most disturbing question is not what she was guarding from others, but what she was guarding from herself. Because in the center of that room, beneath the chair, lay something else. A small iron box, sealed tight, with markings carved deep into its lid. And when they pried it open, they realized why Eleanor had sworn silence for life. Inside the box lay 3 objects. The first, a lock of hair bound with a crimson ribbon far too fresh to have survived a century. The second, a small porcelain doll, its eyes gouged out, its face cracked. And the third, a journal. Eleanor's hand unmistakable. But the words inside were not the writings of a woman consumed by grief. They were instructions. The key is sound, 1 page read. But the silence must hold. They call and I must not answer. The circle weakens if I speak. Another page, scrawled violently, they promised release but they lied. They feed on memory. They demand the child. The men who read it argued among themselves. Some claimed Eleanor was delusional, tormented by her husband's death. Others whispered darker theories, that she had been part of a pact, a blood bargain sealed generations earlier, and the quiet room was her attempt to contain the price. But there was one page in particular that none of them ever spoke of publicly. A page where Eleanor wrote, "The Ashcroft line is not mine. He came to me in another's skin. And what I bore was not a son but a vessel." Do you see now why the truth was silenced? Because this wasn't a ghost story, it was bloodline corruption. Eleanor was telling us that her husband, or whatever wore his form, had left her with something that wasn't human. Something she sealed away not with chains or locks, but with ritual silence, with the refusal to speak its name. The doll, the hair, the journal, they weren't keepsakes. They were anchors. Each object binding a piece of the thing inside the bloodline. And when you step back and look at history, this pattern repeats. Old families rising to wealth and influence after sudden deaths, unexplained pacts, children who seem different. How many times has the mask of grief hidden a ritual of control? How many widows sealed their rooms, their diaries, their lips, while the truth whispered through generations? The Ashcroft widow is not an isolated case. She is a glimpse of the machinery behind aristocracy, behind dynasties, behind power itself. And yet, the most chilling fact remains: the silence did not last forever. Because when the Masons opened that room, they did not just break bricks. They broke the seal. And what Eleanor fought to contain began to breathe again. Weeks after the quiet room was opened, strange events spread through Ashcroft. The lead Mason's wife reported her husband sleepwalking, standing at the foot of their bed whispering words in a language she did not recognize. Another worker drowned in the river, though he was known as a skilled swimmer. The journal disappeared from the local archive, stolen by an unknown hand. And neighbors swore they heard music at night from the abandoned Ashcroft estate, a low humming like a choir of voices in mourning. The men who had entered the room all either left the town or died within the decade, their descendants refusing to speak of it. And here's the question you should be asking yourself: was Eleanor truly silencing herself, or silencing something that used her voice? Because when you read her words, the key is sound, the silence must hold. You begin to wonder, what happens when silence breaks? What happens when the call is answered? And what happens when the truth we bury finally digs its way out? By the 1930s, researchers tried to distance themselves from the Ashcroft affair. They branded it folklore, a provincial superstition, something beneath academic attention. Yet private letters between those same historians tell a different story. One letter, never published, read, "The room was not hers. She was permitted it, allowed it, as if someone, or something, sanctioned her ritual." Do you understand the weight of that? It means Eleanor wasn't just acting alone in grief. She was part of an arrangement, a permission granted by forces the world pretends don't exist. And look at the timing. 1824 was not an ordinary year. It was a year of political upheaval in Virginia, of elite families struggling for dominance in the new American order. Tobacco fortunes built on exploitation were collapsing, while hidden fraternities competed for influence. The Ashcrofts conveniently rose in that storm. Wealth increased, land expanded, political favors arrived. And all of it followed the death of her husband and the sealing of that chamber. Was the widow the price paid? Was silence the coin of their survival? History shrugs it away as coincidence. But no power, no dynasty, no legacy is ever coincidence. The deeper you examine Eleanor's journal, the clearer it becomes that silence itself was the weapon. In one fragment she wrote, "To speak is to invite. To resist is to close. The voice is the gate and I am its keeper." Now think about that in a broader sense. Every culture in history has told us the same truth. Words are power. Ancient priests used chant to bind. Rulers used oaths to command. Secret societies use coded vows, repeating them to reshape the initiate's mind. And Eleanor? She inverted it. She weaponized silence against something that demanded sound. Imagine how unbearable that must have been, knowing the thing behind your grief was always listening, always pressing for acknowledgement, always hungering for your voice. That's why she bricked the room. Not just to hide it physically, but to amplify her silence through stone, to trap the echo, to hold the gate. And here's the unnerving twist. When the Masons opened the room, they didn't just disturb dust. They opened a throat that had been gagged for over a century. And once sound moves again, it never retreats. Soon after the opening, Virginia newspapers recorded a spike in bizarre cases. Families reporting children speaking in voices not their own. Farmers finding livestock mutilated, organs removed with surgical precision. A preacher claimed half his congregation fainted at once during a hymn, each murmuring the same word, Ashcroft. None of this was officially connected to the quiet room, but the timing was undeniable. And here is where the cover-up began. Local officials shut down discussion, forbidding mention of the Ashcroft estate in print. The land was quietly sold to a private trust, the mansion left to rot. Even the map makers erased it, the house simply vanishing from public charts. But why? Why silence? Because silence is the same tool Eleanor used. And when you see silence spreading through officials, churches, newspapers, you realize the truth. They weren't covering up for the town's sake. They were continuing her ritual. The system itself had picked up where she left off, turning censorship into containment. And suddenly the lines blur. Was Eleanor the lone widow battling the dark? Or was she just the first link in a chain of silence that institutions still maintain today? When researchers revisited the Ashcroft papers in the 1960s, something astonishing surfaced. Buried in an archive box mislabeled "Household Accounts" was a torn fragment of her journal, one not seen before. It read, "The bloodline is the door. The child is not mine to keep. They will come for him in cycles, wearing new faces, wielding new empires. They speak through law, through faith, through coin. And they will take him when silence ends." Do you feel the enormity of that? Eleanor wasn't just warning about her own grief. She was describing a system, entities that move through institutions, possessing the faces of priests, judges, merchants. Think about how many times history has pivoted suddenly, not through wars but through unseen hands manipulating leaders like puppets. That is the thread she was pointing to. And if the Ashcroft line was indeed compromised, then every descendant who entered politics, finance, or clergy carried not just a name, but a vessel. And vessels spread. They do not die. They move. That is why silence was the last defense. Because to speak of it is to spread it. And here's where I ask you right now to take part in breaking the silence. If you followed this far, if you felt that pull in your chest like a hidden memory scratching at the surface, then you are already in the circle. You're not a spectator anymore, you're an initiate of this descent. So I want you to comment below the phrase, "The silence breaks." Write it twice. Once for yourself and once for the bloodline that has carried this truth in chains. When you do that, you anchor yourself in the pattern. Not as a pawn, not as a vessel, but as someone who sees through the veil. And let me remind you, subscribe to this channel now because this is only the beginning. You think the Ashcroft widow was unique? No. She was the visible fracture of a hidden architecture that still surrounds you. The quiet room wasn't just in Virginia. The quiet room is everywhere. Every city has one. Every institution has one. And unless you understand the pattern, you may already be standing inside one without even knowing. After 1824, the Ashcroft family grew in wealth almost unnaturally. Despite Virginia's economic decline, they acquired more land, married into other elite bloodlines, and placed sons into political office. But every gain came after tragedy, fires that destroyed rival plantations, illnesses that mysteriously spared only them, scandals where enemies collapsed overnight. And when you trace the records, a chilling pattern emerges. Every generation of Ashcrofts had one child that never appeared in public. A hidden son or daughter, mentioned briefly in baptism logs, then vanishing from census and church records. Where did they go? Why erase them? Scholars dismissed this as clerical error. But ask yourself, would errors conveniently erase the same type of child in every generation for over a century? No. This is deliberate. These children were not lost. They were kept. They were the vessels Eleanor warned of, hidden from prying eyes, prepared for rituals of silence. The quiet room was not a single chamber. It was a system, rooms of flesh, born into families, bricked up in silence until the time came to unseal them. In the 20th century, whispers of the Ashcroft line reached the corridors of power in Washington. One senator, descended from Eleanor's second son, gained sudden influence in foreign policy. His speeches were strange, calm, almost mechanical, but charged with an authority that silenced opponents. A journalist who studied him wrote, "He doesn't persuade. He bends reality. You leave the room believing what you had sworn against an hour before." That journalist died in a car accident before his piece went to print. Another researcher who traced Ashcroft family funds discovered they had ties to banks funding both sides of wars. His notes ended abruptly with the phrase, "The silence spreads through law." The implication is terrifying. What Eleanor contained in one chamber eventually seeped outward, infiltrating institutions. Judges making irrational rulings. Priests speaking doctrine that contradicts their scripture. Leaders passing laws that harm their own people but are accepted without revolt. The vessel had escaped the bricks. It had learned to wear offices, robes, titles. And you, yes you, have been living under its architecture your entire life. But pause. Why silence? Why is silence the constant threat? Because silence is both shield and weapon. Eleanor used silence to contain the entity. The system uses silence to contain awareness. Think about it. When a scandal erupts, what happens? Gag orders. Sealed files. Non-disclosure agreements. When truth trembles on the surface, silence is immediately imposed. And silence is always explained as, for your protection. But protection of who? Of you, or of the vessel? The Ashcroft case reveals the deeper logic. Silence does not protect the weak. Silence protects the parasite. It thrives when you don't speak its name, when you don't question, when you don't resist. Eleanor weaponized silence against it. Institutions weaponized silence against you. The same technique inverted. And once you see that inversion, you understand how psychological control works. Your voice is a gate. Your words open doors. That's why propaganda matters. That's why repetition matters. That's why the system fights to control speech, not because it fears words, but because it fears what words unlock in you. Documents from the 1970s reveal the CIA conducted experiments in Virginia under programs now known as MKUltra. Most people believe these were crude attempts at mind control through drugs and hypnosis. But the Ashcroft connection suggests something darker. Among declassified fragments is one chilling note. Subject hears the call after 4 sessions. Subject resists through silence. Silence breaks on day 7. Does that sound familiar? Eleanor said the silence must hold. Here, a century later, intelligence agencies were deliberately breaking it. Why? Because they weren't inventing control, they were replicating the Ashcroft ritual, inverting it, weaponizing the breach. Every subject that broke silence reported voices, visions, compulsions. The program ended publicly in scandal. But unofficially it never stopped. It simply went underground, woven into culture, education, media. Think about it. The same pattern. A flood of noise, drowning your inner silence, bending you into vessels without your consent. Eleanor fought to keep the silence intact. The system fights to break it in you every day. Now you begin to see why Eleanor's story was buried. Not because it was irrelevant, but because it was blueprint. She stumbled on the ancient pattern, fought it alone, and left us her journal as warning. But power saw opportunity. What she sealed in a single room they scaled across nations. Quiet rooms became offices, parliaments, universities, churches. And every citizen inside them is trained not to question, not to speak, not to hear themselves think. This is why you feel restless at night. Why you sense something isn't right but can't put it into words. It's not madness. It's the silence cracking. You feel the echo of Eleanor's fight. You sense the vessel pressing through the institutions around you. And the deeper truth? They don't just want your obedience. They want your voice. Because your voice is the gate. If you break the silence wrongly, you become the vessel. If you keep the silence blindly, you feed the vessel. Eleanor's path was balance, knowing when to resist and when to speak. But that knowledge was never meant for you. That's why you're hearing it now. And why you'll never be the same after this night. The Ashcroft widow's silence did not begin in Virginia. Patterns identical to hers echo across history. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets describe priestesses who were forbidden to speak after midnight rituals, their silence binding the watchers at the gate. In Egypt, temple initiates swore not just secrecy but absolute muteness for 40 days, lest they wake the Hollow One. Even the early Christian desert fathers practiced silent vigils, believing the spoken word could invite intrusion. Do you see it? Across civilizations, the same ritual, silence as shield. Eleanor was not inventing something new, she was tapping into an ancient lineage of guardianship. But unlike the ancients, she was alone. She had no temple, no order, no hierarchy of mentors to protect her. Just a bloodline wound and a chamber of bricks. And that is why she broke. Alone, silence becomes unbearable. The voices claw. The child cries. The vessel hungers. The ancients knew this truth. Silence is power, but only if the silence is shared. Eleanor's tragedy was isolation. The system's triumph was inversion, forcing us into isolated silence while their voices speak unchallenged. But dig even deeper and the web thickens. A suppressed document in the Vatican archives, referred to only as Codex Umbra, describes families chosen to bear the weight of the unclean inheritance. Each family was assigned guardianship over a vessel, the ritual being enforced by silence, confinement, and secrecy. This document, referenced by scholars in hushed tones, vanishes conveniently whenever requested. Yet whispers persist that one of those families settled in Virginia in the 1700s. Their name was not Ashcroft then. It was changed, anglicized, erased to fit into the colonial gentry. Eleanor, knowingly or not, married into a bloodline bred for containment. Her silence was not choice, it was duty. She bore the vessel not by chance but by design. And suddenly the accident of her husband's death feels orchestrated. A hand removed the old guardian. She was left holding the gate. And in doing so, she became the Ashcroft widow we now remember. Not a victim, not a madwoman, but a conscript into a war waged in shadows across generations. When you recognize this, the pieces align with horrifying clarity. Ancient families used silence to bind vessels. Institutions evolved to hide that silence through censorship and secrecy. Modern agencies weaponized the breaking of silence as psychological warfare. And you? You were born into the aftermath. Raised in a world where every noise is carefully engineered to drown your inner voice, while every silence is forced to suppress your questions. The Ashcroft widow's quiet room becomes a mirror. The bricks are the screens around you, the walls are the algorithms feeding you distraction. The journal is your own subconscious whispering warnings you ignore. And here's the dark irony. The very act of listening to me now is you cracking the bricks around your own chamber. You are standing where the masons stood in 1929, facing the sealed door, wondering if you should break it open. And once you do, once you step inside, there is no way back. Because once you know the truth, the silence never feels safe again. But we must return to the vessel itself. Remember Eleanor's words, the bloodline is the door. If that is true, then vessels are not isolated anomalies. They are inherited doorways, walking gates disguised as human beings. Every era has carried them. Pharaohs, emperors, senators, presidents. Some may have resisted as Eleanor tried. Others embraced the hunger, letting it devour nations in exchange for empire. Look at history's tyrants. Many rose inexplicably, commanding loyalty beyond reason, bending millions with mere words. Do you think that was charisma? No, that was the voice. That was the gate speaking through them. The vessel fed, the silence shattered, the masses fell in line. What Eleanor fought in one child, others unleashed upon civilizations. And those civilizations fell. Because silence, once broken on the wrong terms, spreads like contagion. It doesn't just take a family. It takes an empire. And if you think America is immune, look again. The Ashcrofts were only one thread. How many bloodlines carried similar burdens into the highest offices of this country? And here lies the most dangerous revelation. Eleanor wrote that the vessel does not die. They move, she said, wearing new skins, new names. The child she bore may have died in flesh, but the vessel did not. It transferred. Passed into another Ashcroft. Passed into another family. Passed into another institution. Which means that even now, 200 years later, the vessel still walks. Perhaps it speaks in government chambers. Perhaps it sits in a boardroom. Perhaps it wears a cassock or a uniform or a smile on a screen you see every day. The point is simple. Eleanor's quiet room was temporary. The true quiet room is history itself, bricked and sealed, hiding a parasite that waits for silence to break. And every time you forget, every time you refuse to speak, every time you surrender to noise without listening to your own voice, you are rebuilding the chamber, but leaving the door unlocked. And one day when it breathes fully again, you'll realize the Ashcroft widow was only the beginning. The vessel was never hers. It is ours that in the early 1900s, just before the Ashcroft quiet room was unsealed, an excavation was conducted along the James River. Officially, it was a search for colonial artifacts. Unofficially, diaries of the men involved describe something else. Stone chambers older than Jamestown, older than any recorded European settlement. These chambers bore the same symbols Eleanor drew on her walls. Spirals intersecting triangles, marks like fractured eyes staring outward. The chambers were quietly covered over, dismissed as natural formations. But Eleanor could not have known those symbols unless they already existed in the land, long before her bloodline arrived. Do you see what that means? Virginia was not chosen randomly. The land itself carried the imprint. The Ashcrofts were not victims of coincidence. They were planted in soil already marked. And every family that grew rich in Virginia's early days, Randolphs, Byrds, Carters, shared in the silence. Ask yourself, how many of America's founding families carried vessels across the ocean, into a land that was already waiting for them? This is why history is curated so carefully in America. We are taught the sanitized story: pilgrims, tobacco plantations, revolution. But the true story is ritual. The colonies were not just economic ventures. They were laboratories of silence, testing whether vessels could be contained in a new world. Native tribes warned of whispering fields, where voices lured men into madness. Those warnings were erased, branded as superstition. Why? Because they revealed too much. Imagine if children in school were taught that Virginia's soil hums with voices, that some families were chosen to hold them, that our republic was built not just on independence but on containment. Imagine if you were told that silence is not absence, but occupation. The Founding Fathers knew. Some embraced it, channeling it into documents, codes, lodges. Others resisted, trying to keep the gates sealed. But once silence became law, secrecy, oaths, redactions, the vessel had already won. The Constitution was ink on paper. The quiet room was mortar in the walls of the new empire. In 1947, when the Ashcroft estate finally collapsed into ruin, a final artifact was recovered from the quiet room. Hidden behind the parchment-lined wall was a carved plank of oak, bearing a map. The map was not of Virginia, nor of America as we know it. It was a skeletal outline, a lattice of connected points, like stars arranged in deliberate order. And beside it, in Eleanor's faint hand, the rooms are many. The silence is shared. Scholars dismissed it as doodling, But when the lattice was compared decades later to the distribution of Masonic lodges across the United States, the alignment was uncanny. Every point matched a lodge, a courthouse, or a university chartered in the early republic. Eleanor had not mapped the land. She had mapped the chambers of silence. The architecture of containment stretched across a continent. And once you see that lattice, you realize America is itself a quiet room. A chamber built not for freedom, but for silence. And the bricks are not stone, they are institutions. But here's the inversion that chills to the bone. If America was a quiet room, then the vessel was already inside when the chamber was sealed. Meaning our entire system was constructed not to keep evil out, but to keep it in, circulating, feeding, hidden in plain sight. Every courthouse oath, every congressional prayer, every classified file. They are bricks in Eleanor's wall, binding the vessel inside a national body. And that is why power in this country feels both sacred and suffocating. Why politicians change once they rise. Why judges render decisions that feel inhuman. They are not corrupt in the usual sense. They are resonating chambers, voices carrying the hum Eleanor heard in her child. And you are the citizen standing inside the chamber, mistaking the walls for freedom when they are silence. That is the genius of the system. To make the prison feel like liberty, to make silence feel like choice. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The archaeologists who stumbled on Eleanor's map didn't publish their findings. Some resigned quietly. Others disappeared from academia. But one left a final note in a private journal, found only after his death. The widow was not warning. She was instructing. We are not free men. We are keepers. Think about that. We, ordinary people, are not outside this pattern. We are part of the ritual. Every time you obey without question, every time you swallow the official line, every time you choose silence instead of voice, you are doing exactly what Eleanor did, holding the gate shut. But unlike Eleanor, you are not aware. You are not resisting. You are a brick laid by someone else's design. And the deeper terror? You are not just the brick. You are the bloodline. Because silence passes down. Trauma is inherited. Memory is genetic. The vessel does not need to be born in one family. It spreads through silence itself, until nations become wombs. And once you grasp that, the phrase "land of the free" begins to sound less like truth, and more like containment. That be why the late 20th century fragments of Eleanor's journal were circulating quietly among esoteric circles. Not the whole text, just copied passages, warnings about silence, about the child that is not a son. These groups, hidden lodges, occult researchers, rogue academics, debated endlessly what she meant. But what mattered most wasn't her warnings. It was the method. Eleanor had proven that silence could bind something far older and more dangerous than grief. And so silence became weaponized on a scale she could never have imagined. Think of how our culture changed. The rise of television, then the internet, then endless streams of noise. At first glance, that looks like the opposite of silence. But it is not. True silence is the inner stillness where you hear yourself. Endless distraction is another form of silence. It drowns the self so completely that no true voice remains. Eleanor held her silence like a sword. The system forged silence into chains. And you live in that chain every time you scroll, every time your mind hums with noise, yet you remain inwardly mute. When you consider Eleanor's phrase, "The voice is the gate," you begin to realize why modern propaganda obsesses over your speech. Look around you. Entire wars fought over words. Careers ended because of phrases. Laws passed to regulate what you can and cannot say. Do you believe this is about politeness? About progress? No. It is about the gate. Eleanor was one woman refusing to open her gate. Today, the system wants every gate flung wide, every throat speaking not its own truth but programmed lines. That is why repetition dominates, slogans, chants, hashtags. Because the vessel feeds not on silence alone, but on words drained of soul. Hollow words. Empty repetition. noise disguised as voice. And while you chant, while you obey your true silence, the shield Eleanor carried erodes. You become what she feared, not a guardian but a vessel repeating someone else's hunger. The quiet room is no longer a chamber in Virginia. It is in your mouth, your tongue, your feet, and here lies the second key. Eleanor's journal spoke of cycles. She wrote, "They will come for him in cycles, wearing new faces, wielding new empires." The vessel is not random. It emerges in rhythm. Historians who dared to test this against American events noticed something chilling. Every 50 to 60 years, upheaval erupts. Civil war, depression, cultural revolution, terrorism, economic collapse. Always preceded by an opening of silence. Newspapers call it free speech movements, awakenings, reforms. But to those who know, it looks like the gate cracking open, the vessel moving into new flesh. And look at our own time. We are overdue. The last great silence break was the 1960s. 50 years have passed. And everywhere you turn, silence fractures. Institutions collapsing, voices multiplying, no one listening, everyone speaking but no one hearing. This is not progress. This is ritual. The cycle turns. And somewhere, as you listen now, the vessel takes its next breath. You might think this sounds like paranoia. But remember, the Masons in 1929 thought the same, until they opened the door and could no longer deny what they saw. Remember the scholars who thought Eleanor mad, until her symbols matched forbidden sites buried centuries earlier. Skeptics always laugh, until they stand in the chamber and smell the copper air of silence breaking. You are standing there now. Every headline, every law, every manipulation of speech is a brick pulled from the wall Eleanor built. The vessel doesn't need you to believe in it. It only needs you to obey the silence. And you do, every day. You hold your tongue at work. You censor your thoughts online. You smile while knowing something is wrong. And in those moments you are Eleanor's heir. Not the widow. Not the guardian. The vessel. Because silence that is unconscious no longer protects. It devours. This is the point where most people turn away. Where they close the video, convince themselves it's just story, just folklore. But if you've stayed, if you've carried yourself this far into the descent, then you feel what I mean when I say this is not entertainment. This is inheritance. Eleanor was not warning the world. She was warning you. Because you live in the system her silence birthed. You carry the same burden in your voice, in your blood. And now you face her same choice. Do you hold your silence with awareness or do you let them break it into hollow noise? Comment again below. The silence breaks. Twice. Once for the widow. Once for yourself. And when you do, you declare that you are not passive brickwork in someone else's chamber. You are a gatekeeper who sees. A voice that chooses. And once you claim that, you are no longer asleep. You step into the lineage Eleanor carried alone. But this time, you are not alone. When Eleanor's oak plank was rediscovered in the 1990s, one fragment remained almost overlooked. Faint, nearly erased, yet still legible. The last room is not built of stone. It is built of memory. When they open that, there will be no silence left. Read that again. She wasn't speaking of her chamber. She wasn't even speaking of America's lattice of lodges and courts. She was speaking of us, our minds, memory itself as the final quiet room. That's why institutions fight so hard to rewrite history, to edit textbooks, to bury documents. They are chiseling your inner walls, brick by brick, erasing your ability to hold silence consciously. And once memory is broken, silence breaks with it. The vessel steps freely through a society that no longer remembers how to guard. And you see it now. Generations forgetting their own history, forgetting what their elders warned, forgetting what they themselves lived through. A nation without memory is a vessel without resistance. And Eleanor's words ring louder than ever. When silence ends, they will come. Some claim the Ashcroft estate still stands, hidden on private land, overgrown and guarded. Others swear the quiet room has already been dismantled, its relics distributed to institutions we will never name. But what matters is not whether the house survives. What matters is what escaped it. Reports in the 2000s of strange gatherings in Virginia describe candlelit circles, old families reciting vows of silence, new initiates chosen among political elites. These are not ghost hunters. They are descendants. They are guardians or parasites. No one outside can tell which. And that is the final cruelty of this inheritance. Silence conceals both protectors and predators. You will never know if the one commanding you is resisting the vessel or serving it. You will never know if the silence they impose is shield or chain. Unless you reclaim your own voice. Unless you remember Eleanor's path, not silence by obedience, but silence as weapon. Not voice as noise, but voice as gate. Only then can you discern which side of the ritual you stand on. The psychological systems around you, advertising, politics, social media, are not accidents. They are quiet rooms. Endless noise outside, hollow silence inside, conditioning you until you forget the difference between your thoughts and theirs. This is why you feel exhausted. Why your mind loops phrases you never chose. Why your silence feels like paralysis, not peace. You are not imagining it. You are inside Eleanor's chamber. And the longer you remain passive, the more you resemble her hidden child, vessel instead of guardian. But here is the fracture in their design. Awareness cracks the wall. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you hear your own voice beneath the noise, silence changes. It becomes shield again, not prison. And when that happens, the vessel loses grip. That is why you were never meant to hear this story. Because if too many awaken, the lattice breaks. The architecture fails. The vessel starves. And what empire can survive when its parasite is exposed to the light? But exposure carries danger. Remember the Masons of 1929. They opened the chamber, looked upon the symbols, touched the iron box. And they were never the same. Some lost to madness. Some to death. Some to silence deeper than Eleanor's. That is the price of seeing too much too quickly. And you, listening now, stand in their place. You have opened the room with me. You have smelled the copper air. You have seen the vessel stir in history's bloodstream. The question is, can you bear it? Or will it consume you as it consumed them? That is why I tell you, pause. Hold silence not as emptiness, but as strength. Speak not hollow words, but chosen ones. Guard your memory. Guard your voice. Because once you do, you are no longer victim. You are what Eleanor never had. A conscious heir, aware of the ritual, able to resist not with bricks but with awareness. That is the forbidden path. The one they feared you would walk. So what did Eleanor seal in that room? Was it truly her child, or the memory of what her husband became, or the echo of something older than both? Perhaps all three. The vessel wears many skins. What matters is that she resisted. That she chose silence not out of madness, but out of defiance. And though her line was corrupted, her act remains a template for us. The quiet room is not just history. It is now. It is every sealed file, every censored truth, every inner voice you ignore. And the vessel is not waiting. It is already here, speaking through the mouths of power, feeding on the silence of the obedient. Eleanor left her room to warn us. Her journal was never meant for dusty archives. It was meant for you. You who stand in the cycles turning. You who feel the silence cracking even now. And so we end where she began. A widow in 1824, bricking a room to guard against the unspeakable. And you, in 2025, staring into your own walls, wondering if the silence around you is shield or trap. That is the power of forbidden history. It does not stay buried. It breathes. It finds you. And once you hear it, you are changed. The Ashcroft widow was not mad. She was not cursed. She was the last true guardian. And now, by hearing her story, by carrying her silence, you inherit her burden. The vessel will come again. Perhaps it already has. Perhaps you have heard its voice in leaders, in screens, in whispers at the edge of sleep. But now you know the truth. And knowing is the fracture in its hold. So guard your silence. Choose your words. Break the cycle. Because the quiet room is no longer sealed in Virginia. The quiet room is you.